Sometimes the coldest nights hide the warmest beginnings. The wind howled down from the mountains, carrying with it the taste of snow and the scent of pine. The streets of Whispering Pines were nearly deserted by the time Evelyn Hart and Caleb Boone turned down the narrow lane toward her cottage. The lamps in town had long been extinguished, and only the flicker of their lantern cut through the swirling white. It was a night that made the world seem smaller, softer, as though everything had been wrapped in silence and frost. Evelyn pulled her shawl tighter, not against the cold, but against the strange heat rising in her chest. She could feel Caleb's presence beside her like a steady flame, his steps slow, deliberate, almost reverent. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Words had already been said, quiet words, trembling and unexpected, and now they hung between them, fragile as glass. Caleb's voice still echoed in her ears. No rushing, no pressure. Just letting ourselves feel what we feel and seeing where it leads. He had said it without expectation, with that calm certainty that always disarmed her. And she, after a long heartbeat, had whispered the only answer she could manage. "That's all right with me." It had felt like stepping off a cliff. Now, as snow gathered in her hair and on the dark wool of her morning coat, she tried to make sense of it. This stirring of something she thought had died with her husband, Samuel. Caleb walked beside her, tall and quiet. A man who carried his own ghosts. She'd seen the sadness in his eyes when he thought no one noticed. Maybe that was what drew her to him. Not his strength, but his gentleness, the way he held sorrow like it was something sacred instead of shameful. They reached the small gate that led to her front porch. The hinges creaked when Caleb opened it for her, and she caught the faintest tremor in his breath. The lantern light cast his face in soft gold, and for the first time she saw him not as the ranch hand who mended desks for her students or chopped wood for May Carter, but as a man who looked at her like she was something worth saving. "Thank you for walking me home," she said, her voice barely carrying over the whisper of falling snow. He nodded, his gloved hands tightening on the lantern's handle. "Wouldn't have felt right letting you walk alone on a night like this." A smile flickered at the corners of her mouth, gone as quickly as it came. "I think I can manage, Caleb. I've been walking alone for a while now." His gaze lifted to hers, steady and unflinching. "Maybe it's time you didn't have to." The words struck her like a spark to tinder. She didn't know how to answer, didn't know if she should. Samuel's face flashed through her mind. Kind eyes, a tired smile, the weight of his hand in hers as he faded away. The ache of memory pressed against her ribs. "I should go inside," she murmured. He nodded. Again, though reluctance softened the movement. He lingered a heartbeat too long, the light catching in his pale eyes before he stepped back into the snow. "Get some rest, Miss Hart. You've got a long day tomorrow." She hesitated, then spoke before she could lose her nerve. "Caleb." He turned. Would you come by tomorrow evening? For supper. We could talk. About everything." The grin that spread across his face was sudden and boyish, warming the frozen air between them. "I'd like that. More than you know." When the sound of his footsteps faded, Evelyn stood on her porch with her heart hammering like it hadn't in years. Inside, the small cottage seemed both comfort and cage. She set the lantern down, pulled off her gloves, and pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks. The warmth beneath her skin felt wrong somehow, like sunlight spilling into a room meant for morning. Samuel's portrait sat above the fireplace, his kind eyes watching her from another lifetime. She sank into the chair before the hearth and stared into the flames. What was she doing? Samuel had been gone less than a year. The ache of his absence was still fresh, still raw. How could she be thinking of another man? Her conscience whispered words she didn't want to hear. How could you move on so quickly? How could you love again when the grave hasn't even settled? Tears welled in her eyes, hot and bitter. They spilled over, and she let them, crying for Samuel, for herself, for the cruel unfairness of being alive when the person she loved most was not. But beneath the grief, something stirred, something quieter, deeper. Memory rose like a voice from another world. Samuel's voice frail but certain. "I want you to be happy, Evelyn. Promise me you'll let yourself be happy." She had promised. She'd stood beside his deathbed, his hand fragile as paper in hers, and sworn she would try. At the time, she hadn't believed she could. Happiness had felt like betrayal. Now, in the dim light of her little cottage, she wondered if Samuel had known something she didn't. That healing required permission. When sleep came, it wasn't haunted by the nightmares that had plagued her since his death. Instead, she dreamed of Samuel standing in a field of yellow roses, smiling, waving goodbye. Beyond him stood another figure, a man half shadow, half light, waiting among whispering pines. She could not see his face, but she felt peace radiate from him, steady and sure. She woke before dawn, the fire gone to embers. The room was cold, but her heart wasn't. The sky outside glowed with the first fragile silver of morning. She rose, wrapped herself in Samuel's old quilt, and went to the window. Snow blanketed the world, clean and new. Somewhere in the distance, a lone horse neighed. Maybe Caleb already at work before sunrise, mending fences, feeding stock. The thought made her chest ache in a way that wasn't entirely pain. She pressed her palm against the frosted glass and whispered into the pale morning, "I don't know if I'm ready, Samuel, but maybe that's the point. Maybe love doesn't wait until we're ready." Her breath fogged the window, blurring her reflection until she could almost see another woman staring back. Not the widow dressed in black, but someone beginning to thaw. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine through the valley, as if the world itself was exhaling after a long, cold silence. Evelyn closed her eyes and let it in. As dawn crept across whispering pines, she wondered, was she betraying her first love or finally keeping the promise he'd begged her to make? They say a teacher can shape lives. But what happens when her own heart becomes the lesson she never planned to teach? Snowflakes drifted like white feathers over the small prairie town of Willow Creek, quieting the world outside the one-room schoolhouse. Inside, Evelyn Hart's voice trembled just slightly as she read aloud from a worn reader, her mind miles away from the neat rows of children staring up at her. Her hands were steady on the book, but her heart, that was another matter entirely. Caleb's voice still echoed in her mind, his laugh still warm in her chest. It had been months since he'd returned from the high country, yet every time she closed her eyes, she saw him standing under that same gray sky the day he rode back into her life. The lesson she was supposed to teach was about arithmetic, but she'd already lost the numbers. The students sensed it, especially little Clara May, a bright-eyed girl who sat in the front row with braids tied by blue ribbons. Clara's pencil paused mid-sentence. She studied her teacher for a long moment before whispering, "You look happy today, Miss Hart. Really happy." The words caught Evelyn off guard. She blinked, set the book down, and smiled. That shy, unguarded smile that had been missing for so long. "Do I?" she asked softly. Clara nodded, grinning, and the room seemed to warm a little, even with the frost pressing against the windows. When the school bell rang, the children bundled up and spilled into the snow, their laughter fading into the quiet afternoon. Evelyn stayed behind to tidy the desks, tracing a finger over the initials carved by generations of restless students. It was strange. After all the loss, after burying her husband Thomas 3 winters ago, she had never expected her heart to wake again. Yet here she was, blushing at the memory of Caleb's rough hands and gentle eyes, feeling like a girl with secrets. The door creaked open. A cold wind swept in, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something familiar, the faint perfume of lilacs. May Carter stepped inside, brushing snow from her shawl. May had been the town's midwife for decades, a woman both feared and loved for her honesty. Her gaze could see right through a person. "You were far away just now," May said, setting her basket down on the teacher's desk. "Thinking of him again?" Evelyn tried to hide her smile, but May wasn't fooled. "It's written all over your face," she went on. "Grief and hope, tangled together like wild vines." Evelyn sighed, lowering her eyes. It feels wrong, May. Like I'm betraying Thomas. He was a good man. And Caleb, he's different. I don't know what to do with that. May's eyes softened. She stepped closer, her voice lowering to that calm, grounded tone that always seemed to anchor the room. Evelyn, grief has no calendar. It doesn't ask permission to leave, and love doesn't ask permission to return. They're both wild things, and they'll do as they please. Evelyn swallowed hard. I still wear Thomas's ring, she whispered. Then wear it, May said. A ring doesn't close a heart, it circles it. You don't stop loving one person by loving another. She placed a gentle hand on Evelyn's arm. Your heart isn't full, dear. It's wide. There's room for both men, there always was. The words struck Evelyn like a bell ringing through the still air. Wide, not full. She turned them over in her mind as she packed her books and snuffed out the lantern. Outside, twilight deepened. Snow fell heavier now, softening the town into silence. She thought of the candlelight she and Caleb had shared that night by the riverbank. The way he had spoken so little yet made her feel so seen. And she thought of Thomas, his laughter in the barn, his steady hands. Two men, two different kinds of love. And her heart caught somewhere between them, still learning what it meant to be alive again. As May buttoned her coat, she gave Evelyn a long look. Don't shut the door on what God might be sending back to you, she said. You prayed for healing. You never said how it should come. The words lingered long after May left. Evelyn stood alone in the dim schoolhouse, the crackle of the stove the only sound. She walked to the window and watched the world turn white, her reflection staring back. Older, wiser, softer. She could almost hear her husband's voice, not in sorrow, but in understanding. Then from outside came the faint crunch of boots on snow. Slow, hesitant. She turned sharply. Through the glass, a figure emerged from the blur of white. Broad shoulders, familiar stance, a shape she'd known in another lifetime. Caleb. He paused by the steps, brushing snow from his hat, uncertain if he should knock. In his hands he held a covered basket, something carefully prepared, wrapped with cloth. For a moment he just stood there, the falling snow settling on his coat, the light from the schoolhouse spilling over him like a hesitant invitation. Evelyn's breath caught. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the door, heart pounding against her ribs. She remembered May's words. Grief has no calendar. Love has no rules. Maybe she didn't have to choose one kind of love over another. Maybe she only had to open the door. But as her fingers touched the handle, doubt surged. What if she was wrong? What if this was too soon? The latch clicked. And then the door swung open. Caleb stood there in the pale glow of the lantern, snow melting in his hair, eyes searching hers with a question he didn't yet dare to ask. The basket trembled slightly in his hands. I brought something, he said, voice low, uncertain. The warmth between them was fragile, suspended like the moment before a candle flame catches. Evelyn hesitated, torn between the memory of the past and the promise of something new. And then, just as the wind howled through the cracks of the old schoolhouse, a shadow crossed Caleb's face. Something more than the cold, something unsaid. The schoolhouse door stood open to the storm, and as Evelyn met his eyes, she saw it. Caleb wasn't just bringing a gift, he was bringing news. Something that could change everything she thought she'd learned about love, loss, and the heart's true lesson. In a single evening, light, grief, and forgiveness share the same table. The storm had thinned by dusk, leaving the town wrapped in a soft, icy hush. The world outside Evelyn Hart's schoolhouse was blanketed in new snow, each flake glimmering under the last of the fading light. Inside, she moved slowly, gathering papers, wiping the chalk from the board, her mind still echoing with May Carter's words from earlier that afternoon. Your heart isn't full, it's wide. The phrase had settled deep inside her like a seed waiting for warmth. She had just finished setting the last reader onto the shelf when she heard a faint knock at the door. It wasn't sharp or impatient, but tentative, like the hand that made it wasn't sure it had the right to. For a moment, she considered pretending not to hear. The whole town would talk if Caleb Boone lingered here after dark. But then through the window, she saw the flicker of a lantern and the familiar outline of a man standing in the snow. Her pulse skipped. He'd actually come. Evelyn opened the door and the cold rushed in like a tide. Caleb stood there, hat in one hand, the other holding a covered basket that steamed faintly in the night air. His face looked half hopeful, half apologetic. "Evening, Miss Hart," he said quietly. "I brought supper, like I said. Jimmy at the ranch sent some stew and May made biscuits. Thought maybe you hadn't eaten yet." His voice faltered and he started to step back. "If it's too late, I'll—" "Don't," she interrupted softly, surprising even herself. "Don't go. Come in, Caleb." For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then he nodded, brushing the snow from his shoulders before stepping inside. The faint scent of pine and horse leather followed him, mixing with the warmth from the stove. Evelyn took the basket, her fingers brushing his glove. In the exchange, a small electric contact that lingered longer than it should have. "You didn't have to do this," she said, setting the food on her desk. "I know," he replied, but I wanted to." There was nothing else to say for a moment. They moved around each other carefully, like dancers learning the first steps of a waltz neither wanted to admit they knew. Evelyn brought out 2 plates from the small cupboard. A mismatched pair, one chipped along the rim. Caleb poured the stew, and the smell of slow-cooked meat and herbs filled the room. They sat at the schoolhouse table, the only light coming from the lamp between them. Shadows swayed gently on the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, steady and distant. At first, they spoke of ordinary things: the weather, the students, May's stubborn mule. Evelyn told him how Clara Evans had mastered long division faster than any student she'd ever had, and how Daniel Torres had taken to reading her old textbooks about mechanics. Caleb listened, his elbows resting on the table, his gaze steady but soft. Then silence fell. Not an awkward one, but heavy, charged, waiting for what would come next. Evelyn's spoon hovered over her bowl. "You asked me once," she began, her voice quiet, "what my husband was like." Caleb didn't move, only nodded. "His name was Samuel," she continued. "He was gentle, a schoolteacher like me. He used to write poetry on the back of lesson plans, and he always smelled of ink and cedar." She smiled, faintly remembering. "He wasn't brave like you. Not in the way people think of bravery, but when he got sick, he faced it without bitterness. That was his kind of courage." Caleb's expression was unreadable, but his hands clenched slightly, the knuckles white in the lamplight. "He made me promise something," Evelyn went on. "The night before he died, he told me not to stop living. He said if I ever found joy again, I was to take it without guilt." She drew a slow breath. "I promised him I would, but for months afterward I couldn't. It felt wrong to laugh, to want, to look forward to anything." Her eyes glistened. "And now, suddenly I do. And that scares me." Caleb set his spoon down, his voice low. "You kept that promise longer than most could. Samuel sounds like the kind of man who'd want you to keep living, not just surviving." Evelyn looked at him. "And what about you, Caleb? What made you stop living?" He hesitated, then exhaled through his nose. "I guess the war broke more than bones. When I came back, my brother didn't. He was the good one, the one my family was proud of. I got angry, at God, at the world, at myself. I made some bad choices." He paused, the lamplight catching on the faint scar along his jaw. "I stole a few horses, thinking I was just taking from men who could afford to lose them. Ended up in Yuma prison for 3 years. That's where May found me after I got out. Gave me work, a roof, and a second chance." He looked at her, then really looked. "Funny thing, Miss Hart. I thought my life ended the night they locked that cell. But turns out, endings don't always mean what you think they do." The words sank deep into the stillness between them. Evelyn found herself blinking back tears again, not from sorrow but recognition. They were two people carved from the same wood, shaped by loss, tempered by guilt, and still somehow standing. Caleb leaned back, his gaze steady. "I didn't tell you all that for pity. Just thought you deserved to know the kind of man sitting at your table." "I know exactly the kind of man you are," she said softly. "One who's honest enough to be ashamed and brave enough to change. That's rare, Caleb." He blinked, as though unsure what to do with her words. A faint, self-conscious smile ghosted across his mouth. The lamp between them burned lower, its flame thinning to gold. Evelyn glanced at the clock on the wall. "It's late," she said quietly, though neither of them moved to stand. Caleb finally rose, gathering his hat. "I should let you rest." Evelyn stood too, following him to the door. The air outside had gone still, the snow glittering under the moon. He turned back before stepping out, his breath visible in the cold. "I don't know where this road leads," he said, "and I don't want to rush you into anything you ain't ready for. But Evelyn," his voice softened, "would you stand beside me on Christmas Eve? Not as friends, but as something more?" The words hung there, fragile and real. Evelyn's heart thudded once, twice. She wanted to answer, but the sound of the wind filled the space where words should have been. Caleb tipped his hat, his eyes never leaving hers. "Think on it," he murmured, and stepped out into the snow, leaving Evelyn alone in the glow of the dying lamplight, her heart trembling between the past she mourned and the future waiting just beyond the door. On the holiest night of the year, even grief can turn into grace. The days that followed Caleb's visit seemed to melt together, each one colored by anticipation and the quiet pulse of something new stirring in Evelyn Hart's life. For the first time in nearly a year, she found herself looking forward to something, not dreading the empty hours that stretched after sunset, not fearing the silence that had once haunted her small cottage. When she finally said yes to Caleb Boone's invitation, the word felt both terrifying and freeing. Whispering Pines had a way of wrapping itself in magic come December. Pine boughs hung from every window and wreaths of red berries marked each porch. The townsfolk, hard people forged by loss and distance, seemed to soften as Christmas drew near. The general store smelled of cinnamon and lamp oil. Hank Miller had strung up tin stars along his roof, insisting that even the roughest town in the Arizona territory deserved to shine once a year. Evelyn walked through those bustling streets each morning with a strange flutter in her chest. Everyone seemed to know, or at least suspect, that she and Caleb were becoming something more than polite acquaintances. Yet to her surprise, the town's curiosity wasn't cruel. There were smiles where once there might have been whispers, nods instead of turned shoulders. Clara Evans was the first to say what everyone else danced around. After class one afternoon, she lingered behind as the others bundled up and ran laughing into the snow. Evelyn had been erasing the chalkboard, her thoughts elsewhere, when Clara spoke. "Miss Hart," she began shyly, twisting her mittens, "is Mr. Boone going to take you to the Christmas service?" Evelyn nearly dropped the eraser. "Now, what makes you ask that?" Clara smiled, her brown eyes wide with innocence and mischief. "Because he looks at you the way my daddy used to look at my mama. Like you hung the stars yourself." Evelyn turned away, busying herself with straightening books to hide the color rising in her cheeks. "You're far too observant for your own good," she said gently. Clara tilted her head. "He's a good man, Miss Hart. Everyone says so. Even Daddy says Mr. Boone's worked harder than anyone to make things right." The mention of Henry Evans made Evelyn pause. Henry had been a quiet man since his wife's death, withdrawn, polite but distant. That he would speak kindly of Caleb said much about the way the town's perception had changed, and perhaps about how much people wanted to believe in second chances. When the children had gone, Evelyn lingered by the window, watching their footprints trail off into the snowy street. Her classroom, once a place filled only with duty, now felt alive again. Daniel Torres had taken to staying late after lessons, poring over borrowed books of geometry and engineering. "I'm going to build bridges someday," he'd told her proudly. Leila Torres, his younger sister, had begun writing poetry in 2 languages, her soft voice trembling with passion when she read them aloud. It wasn't just Evelyn who was healing. It was the whole town. Perhaps love in its quietest forms had a way of mending more than just 2 hearts. As the week drew on, the air grew colder, the snow heavier. Christmas Eve approached like a promise and a test. Evelyn spent her evenings preparing small gifts for her students, homemade bookmarks, a few knitted scarves, the sort of simple offerings she could afford. But beneath each careful stitch, her thoughts kept drifting back to Caleb. She replayed their dinner in her mind, the warmth of the lamplight, the tremor in his voice when he told her about his past. There had been no judgment, only understanding between them. And now, with Christmas approaching, she found herself wondering what that understanding truly meant. The morning before Christmas Eve, Evelyn visited May, Carter's ranch, to deliver a small basket of baked goods. The older woman greeted her with her usual brisk affection, ushering her in before she could protest the cold. "Well, if it isn't the prettiest teacher in Whispering Pines," May said, hanging up Evelyn's cloak. "I hear you're keeping company with my favorite reformed outlaw." Evelyn flushed, but May only laughed. "Oh, don't look so scandalized. This town's got more skeletons than my root cellar. If folks can't forgive a man who's paid for his sins and built something good since, then they've forgotten what Christmas is for." They sat by the fire, sipping coffee thick with cream. May's eyes softened as she studied Evelyn. "You know Samuel would be proud of you," she said quietly. Evelyn froze. "You think so?" May nodded. "You loved him well, and now you're learning how to love again. That doesn't dishonor him, child. It honors what he taught you." The words sank into Evelyn's heart, gentle and solid as snowfall. That night as she walked home, the town was alive with music. From the church came the sound of voices rehearsing hymns. From the saloon, laughter drifted into the cold. The air shimmered with the scent of pine and smoke. Evelyn paused on the wooden bridge that crossed the frozen creek, watching her breath plume into the night. She thought of all that had changed since autumn. The despair that once weighed her down, now replaced by something fragile but real. Hope, the kind that could coexist with sorrow. When she reached her cottage, she lit her small oil lamp and set it by the window. The flame wavered, casting long shadows against the walls. She looked around her home, the neat stack of books by the hearth, Samuel's photograph on the mantel, the shawl May had given her draped across the chair. Everything familiar, yet everything felt slightly new, as if some quiet transformation had been unfolding in the corners of her life. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the faint sound of distant bells. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken without knowing why. Perhaps it was the restlessness of anticipation, or perhaps the sense that someone was drawing near. Then came the knock. It was soft but sure, 3 deliberate taps that cut through the quiet. Evelyn froze, her hand halfway to the lamp. The flame trembled, and so did she. Slowly she rose and crossed the room, her heart thudding with every step. Through the window pane she saw him. Caleb Boone stood in the snow, hat in hand, his shoulders dusted white, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The lantern beside him cast a warm glow over his face, and in his hand he held a small wooden box. He didn't move, didn't call out, just waited, his expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. For a long moment, Evelyn couldn't move either. She stood there, the lamplight flickering across her face, torn between the safety of solitude and the pull of something far greater. She reached for the latch. The door creaked open, and the light from her lamp spilled out onto the snow where Caleb stood, holding the small wooden box that would change everything. Every second chance begins with a leap of faith. The church of Whispering Pines had never looked so beautiful. On Christmas Eve, it glowed like a lantern in the snow, its steeple wrapped in evergreen garlands, its windows alive with the flicker of hundreds of candles. The scent of pine and melted wax mingled with the sound of voices, rough, tender, hopeful, singing carols that rose into the cold night sky. Evelyn Hart stood just outside the doors for a long moment, her gloved hand resting against the worn wood, steadying herself. She could hear them inside, the laughter, the hymns, the rustle of townsfolk filling the pews. It had been nearly a year since she'd last stepped into this place, not since Samuel's funeral, when the same air had smelled of lilies and grief instead of pine and joy. But tonight was different. Tonight the world felt reborn, even if she wasn't sure she was ready to be. The door opened and a rush of warmth and light swept over her. Caleb Boone stood there, hat in hand, his dark coat dusted with snow. He smiled, the kind of quiet, steady smile that could still her racing heart. "You came," he said softly. Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. "I said I would." He offered his arm and she took it, feeling the strength beneath his sleeve, the simple human warmth that anchored her in a world that had once felt unbearably cold. Together they stepped into the golden light. The congregation turned as they entered. Conversations paused, smiles bloomed, and a murmur of approval rippled through the small sanctuary. The people of Whispering Pines had watched them dance this slow waltz of grief and hope for months. Now seeing them together on Christmas Eve, even the skeptics found themselves smiling. They took a seat near the front, shoulder to shoulder. The choir began to sing Silent Night, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn found she could breathe easily. Her eyes drifted to the candles along the altar, each one representing a prayer, a promise, or a memory. She thought of Samuel, of his gentle hands and his voice whispering, "Promise me you'll live again." As the final hymn faded, Reverend Cole stepped forward, speaking of hope, forgiveness, and new beginnings. His words felt personal, as if meant for her alone. Evelyn bowed her head, but when she looked up again, she realized Caleb was watching her. There was something in his eyes, nervousness, tenderness, and a flicker of determination. When the service ended, the townsfolk rose, greeting one another, exchanging food and gifts, laughter echoing under the high wooden beams. Evelyn turned to Caleb, intending to thank him for the evening, but he touched her hand lightly. "Come with me," he said. He led her to a quiet corner near the altar, away from the crowd. The light there was softer, the shadows deeper, the air thick with the scent of candle wax. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. "Caleb," she began, but the words fell away when she saw his hands. They trembled slightly as he reached into his vest pocket. When he withdrew them, he held a small wooden box, worn smooth, the kind a man might carry for years. "I wasn't sure if I should do this tonight," he said, voice low. "But life's taught me that waiting for the perfect moment just means losing the ones that matter." He opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a ring, a simple gold band with a small, luminous pearl. It gleamed softly in the candlelight, pure and delicate, like moonlight caught in glass. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "It's all I've got left of her. My brother Sam gave it to me before he died and told me to save it for the woman who saw me for who I could be, not who I was." He took a slow breath, steadying himself. "Evelyn Hart, you're that woman. You saw past my mistakes, my scars. You saw the man trying to make amends." Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the eyes of the town turning toward them, whispers spreading like wind through wheat. Caleb didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. His entire focus was on her. "I know it soon," he went on, his voice roughening with emotion. "And I know people will talk. But I also know life's too short to wait for perfect timing. I want to build a life with you, a real one, full of hard days and good ones. I want to wake up knowing you're there beside me, and I'll do everything I can to make you proud that you took a chance on me." The church was utterly still. Every creak of wood, every flicker of flame seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn stared at the ring, then at the man kneeling before her. This reformed ranch hand who'd once believed he didn't deserve a second chance. Her heart raced. She thought of Samuel's voice, of May's words, of the children in her classroom, of all the lives that had quietly grown brighter around her. This wasn't about replacing the past. It was about honoring it by daring to live again. Her lips parted, but her voice trembled when she spoke. Yes? Caleb's eyes widened, a soft laugh escaping him. Yes? Yes, she said again, stronger this time. Yes, Caleb Boone, I will marry you. Applause broke out before he even rose to his feet. Someone cried out, "About time!" from the back. Hank Miller whistled. Even Reverend Cole was smiling as he wiped his glasses. The sound swelled, filling the church until Evelyn thought the walls themselves might shake. Caleb slid the ring onto her finger. The pearl caught the candlelight and shimmered like something alive. He stood, his hands still trembling, and she found herself smiling through tears. The crowd pressed closer, offering congratulations, laughter, blessings. May Carter appeared, tears streaming freely down her weathered cheeks. "You did it, girl," May said, hugging her tight. "You found your way home." For the rest of the evening, Whispering Pines felt less like a town and more like one big family. They shared cider, sang hymns, and told stories of lost loves and found ones. And though the candles burned low and the snow thickened outside, the warmth in that small church seemed endless. When the night finally quieted and the last of the townsfolk drifted home, Evelyn lingered behind. The church was nearly dark now, the air still heavy with the scent of pine. She moved to the altar and looked down at her hand. The pearl glowed softly against her skin as if it carried its own light. She thought of all that had brought her here, the train she'd missed, the husband she'd lost, the kindness that had saved her. The ring felt impossibly light, yet it bore the weight of everything she'd lived through. Alone in that hush, she whispered, "Am I ready to stop being Samuel's widow?" The question hung in the air, fragile and uncertain, as the last candle flickered out and the church fell into silence. Some vows are made in church, others are made in the heart long before. The morning after the Christmas Eve service dawned pale and still, the world blanketed in quiet snow that sparkled beneath a timid sun. Evelyn Hart woke before dawn. The air in her small cottage chilled, the fire in her stove little more than embers. Yet she felt warm, warmer than she had in months, because when she lifted her hand, the pearl on her finger caught the first slant of morning light and seemed to glow from within. For a long while she sat at her small kitchen table, staring at that ring. She half expected guilt to come creeping in, the familiar whisper that she was moving too quickly, daring too much. But instead what came was peace, the kind of peace that didn't erase sorrow but made room for it. The kind that whispered, "You've done the hard part, you've lived through the storm. Now let yourself rest in the calm." When Caleb Boone came by later that afternoon, snow dusting his hat and shoulders, his grin said everything. "So," he said, half teasing, half shy, "when does a man like me get to marry the bravest woman in Whispering Pines?" Evelyn laughed softly, the sound surprising them both. "I was thinking New Year's Day," she replied, "if May Carter doesn't faint from the scandal of it." Caleb's eyes brightened. "That's a week away." "I know," she said, meeting his gaze. "I don't want to wait for perfect timing, Caleb. We've both learned life doesn't promise that." He reached across the table, his calloused fingers brushing hers. "Then New Year's it is." From that moment on, the entire town seemed to spring into motion. Whispering Pines had a way of rallying around its people, especially when joy was scarce and needed protecting. May Carter took charge the way only May could. Firmly, efficiently, like a general commanding troops before a battle. Within hours, she had half the town organized. "This isn't just a wedding," she declared to anyone who would listen. "It's proof that good things still grow here, even after frost." Clara Evans volunteered to sew the gown, her nimble fingers working tirelessly by the light of the schoolhouse stove. "I've never made a wedding dress before," she admitted one afternoon as Evelyn stopped by to check on her. "But I think I know what happiness looks like now. I can stitch that into fabric." Daniel Torres, tall and serious beyond his years, offered to build benches for the guests. "Every celebration needs some place for people to rest," he said simply. "Seems right to build something that'll last." And Lila Torres, always the poet, began writing verses for the ceremony. Lines about courage and loss and the stubborn hope that keeps people standing when life tries to knock them down. When she read a few aloud to Evelyn, the teacher had to turn away to hide her tears. Whispering pines hummed with purpose. The townsfolk shared flour and fabric, offered spare candles, even lent horses to carry supplies from nearby settlements. In those few short days, the small town transformed into something radiant, a living testament to the belief that love, in any form, was worth the work it demanded. But even as joy wrapped itself around her like a warm quilt, Evelyn knew there was one thing left undone, one promise she still needed to keep. That evening, when the town slept beneath the hush of fresh snowfall, she sat at her desk by the window, lit only by a single candle. Before her lay a blank sheet of paper and her late husband's photograph. Samuel's eyes, captured forever in shades of gray, looked back at her with that same quiet kindness that had steadied her through so much of her life. Evelyn dipped her pen in ink and began to write. "My dearest Samuel, it's Christmas night, and I'm about to do something you once told me I would. You said, 'Promise me you'll live again.' I didn't believe I could. For months I walked through life like a shadow, afraid that moving forward meant letting go of you. But I understand now, it doesn't. Love doesn't vanish when one of us leaves. It changes shape. It becomes memory, comfort, and courage. I found someone kind, Samuel, a man who carries his own scars but wears them with humility. He doesn't replace you. He reminds me that love can survive even after it's been broken, and I think you'd like him." The ink blurred as a tear fell onto the paper. Evelyn smiled through it, wiped her eyes, and kept writing. "I'm not leaving you behind. I'm carrying you forward. Every good thing that comes next, every joy I find will carry the echo of what we once shared. Thank you for loving me so well that I could love again." When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside Samuel's Bible, the one she still kept on her nightstand. Then she blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, feeling both the ache of farewell and the strange, radiant freedom that followed it. Over the next few days, preparations for the wedding consumed every waking hour. May inspected every detail with the precision of a master craftsman. "You can't start a marriage without good food and good company," she'd say, waving her hand toward the kitchen. "One feeds the body, the other the soul." Hank Miller brought barrels of cider from the general store, and Reverend Cole agreed to perform the ceremony in May's barn, where the walls were sturdy and the light fell just right through the rafters. Someone found a fiddle, another a drum, and soon music filled the air, spilling from every porch and every heart. On New Year's Eve, the night before the wedding, Evelyn returned home exhausted but content. Her small cottage glowed with warmth. The dress Clara had sewn hung from the doorframe, its cream-colored fabric gleaming faintly in the lamplight. It was simple but beautiful, exactly what she'd wanted. She brushed her hand across the gown and smiled. Tomorrow she would walk toward a new chapter. Tomorrow she would take the vow her heart had already made the moment she said yes to Caleb Boone. Outside, snow began to fall again, heavy and slow, like blessings from the sky. The wind carried the distant sound of laughter from the Carter Ranch, where the townsfolk were still working late, preparing for the morning celebration. Evelyn wrapped her shawl tighter, gazing out the window. The moon hung low and silver, watching over the valley. She had just started banking the fire when a knock startled her. It came softly 3 times, just as it had on Christmas Eve. Evelyn's breath caught. She crossed the room, heart thudding, and opened the door. May Carter stood there, bundled in her coat, snow clinging to her hat and shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her eyes bright with mischief and tenderness. "I know it's late," May said, stepping inside before Evelyn could protest. "But I brought you something." In her hands was a small bundle wrapped in linen tied with a faded blue ribbon. May held it out gently like something precious. "This belonged to me," she said quietly, "and it's time it belonged to you." Evelyn unfolded the linen with trembling fingers, and beneath it lay something delicate and white, a piece of lace yellowed by age, shimmering faintly in the firelight. May's voice was soft as prayer. Every bride needs something borrowed, and every new love deserves to be blessed by an old one. Every bride carries a ghost down the aisle. Evelyn carries two. The snow had fallen softly through the night, blanketing whispering pines in a hush that felt almost sacred. When Evelyn Hart opened the door for May Carter, the warmth from her fire spilled out into the cold, catching the falling flakes in a glow of amber light. May stepped inside, stamping her boots and shaking off the chill, carrying the small linen bundle she'd mentioned the night before. Evelyn had expected something practical, perhaps an heirloom brooch or a shawl. But the way May cradled the parcel told her it was more than that. May moved straight to the table by the fire and set it down with a kind of reverence. "Go on," she said, nodding toward it. "Open it." Evelyn untied the faded blue ribbon, her fingers trembling just a little. Inside the linen, folded carefully, lay a lace veil, delicate and yellowed with age, but still beautiful. The intricate patterns caught the firelight, shimmering faintly as though woven with threads of memory. Evelyn lifted it gently, feeling how light it was, how fragile, and yet how strong to have endured all these years. "It was mine," May said softly. "Wore it the day I married my James. My mother-in-law made it by hand, stitch by stitch, and she used to say a piece of love got caught in every loop. I thought it was just an old woman's sentimentality back then, but when I lost him I realized she'd been right. Love lingers in the things we keep." Evelyn swallowed hard. "May, I don't know what to say." "Say yes to wearing it tomorrow," May replied, her smile faint but full of affection. "Every bride should have something old and something borrowed. This covers both." Evelyn ran her thumb across the lace, tracing the delicate pattern. "It's beautiful, but are you sure you want to part with it?" May laughed, a warm, throaty sound that carried both humor and heartache. "Child, if keeping it locked in a box was going to bring my James back, I'd have done that years ago. But love's not meant to be hoarded, it's meant to be passed along. You're like a daughter to me, Evelyn, the daughter I never had. Seeing you happy, seeing you choose life after loss, that's a gift I never thought I'd live to witness." Evelyn looked up sharply, emotion catching her off guard. "May," but May only reached across the table and took her hand, her grip firm and warm. "Listen to me now. Marriage isn't about forgetting what came before. It's about carrying it differently. James has been gone near 20 years, and I still talk to him when the wind howls too loud. I still feel his hand on my shoulder some nights. That's how love works. It doesn't fade, it changes form. You'll learn that too." Evelyn blinked against the tears that burned her eyes. "I think I already am." May nodded, satisfied. "Good, then you're ready." She stood, adjusting her coat. "Now I'd best be getting home before the snow turns to ice. Big day tomorrow." As May turned toward the door, Evelyn spoke impulsively. "May, thank you for everything, for believing in me when I didn't." May turned back, her eyes shining. "Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow, when you walk down that aisle, you do it with your head high. That'll be thanks enough." When she left, the house felt impossibly still. The clock ticked softly, the fire whispered against the wood, and the veil lay across the table like a fragile bridge between past and future. Evelyn sat for a long while, simply looking at it. Finally, she rose and went to the small chest where she kept Samuel's photograph. She carried it to the mantel, setting it beside the lamp. The picture was old now, a little faded, but his features were still clear. The gentle eyes, the slight smile. She could almost hear his voice in the rustle of the flames. "I'm getting married tomorrow," she said quietly. The words sounded strange in her mouth, like speaking a spell aloud for the first time. "To a man named Caleb Boone. You'd like him, Samuel. He's kind and patient. He's known sorrow, too. We understand each other in ways I didn't think possible." She sat, folding her hands in her lap. "I've been so afraid that loving him meant letting go of you. But May helped me see. That's not what this is. I'll always love you. You were my first great love, the one who taught me what it meant to give your whole heart to someone. You taught me gentleness. You taught me how to hope, and that's what I'm carrying with me now." Her gaze drifted to the veil and she smiled faintly. "You'd have laughed at me, fussing over a dress and a borrowed veil like a nervous girl. But I think you'd also be proud. You'd want me to keep that promise, to live, to love, to be happy again." The fire cracked softly, sending a tiny ember drifting up the chimney. Evelyn closed her eyes. For the first time, thinking of Samuel didn't hurt. It felt like standing in sunlight after a long winter. She realized she wasn't saying goodbye, she was saying thank you. Hours passed in quiet reflection. Outside, the snow deepened, muting every sound. The wind moved through the pines, carrying faint whispers across the valley, echoes of laughter, hymns, life. Whispering Pines had always seemed aptly named, she thought. It was a place where even the wind carried stories of those who'd loved, lost, and dared again. As the clock neared midnight, Evelyn folded the veil and placed it on the chair beside her bed. The delicate lace caught the lamplight, glowing softly like frost kissed by dawn. She undressed slowly, her mind alive with both peace and anticipation. She paused once more before Samuel's picture. "Good night," she whispered. "Thank you for every bit of the life we shared. Tomorrow I'll carry you with me into what comes next." When she finally lay down, the quiet wrapped around her like a blessing. Outside, the snowstorm had ceased entirely and a silvery stillness settled over the land. The moonlight pressed through the window, landing squarely on the veil where it rested. Evelyn's eyes fluttered closed, her last thought a simple prayer. Let tomorrow be kind. Far away, church bells stirred faintly in the cold air, their sound distant but unmistakable. Whispering Pines slept, unaware that dawn was already preparing its first light, that the new year would begin not with silence but with celebration. As the first blush of morning crept across the horizon, the lace veil shimmered where it lay, catching the sun's newborn rays. Outside, the bells of Whispering Pines began to toll, their notes bright and sure, the sound of new beginnings calling Evelyn Hart to her wedding day, the day she thought she'd never live to see, when sorrow became salvation. New Year's morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of winter day that felt scrubbed clean by the wind. The snow that had fallen overnight gleamed beneath the bright blue sky, untouched except for a few sets of footprints leading toward May Carter's ranch. Evelyn Hart stood by her window, gazing out over that glittering landscape, her heart thrumming with a rhythm she hadn't felt since she was a girl. The town below seemed hushed, as if even the world itself had paused to watch this day unfold. On her chair lay the lace veil May had given her, its edges glowing faintly in the sunlight that streamed through the window. Clara's gown, cream-colored and soft as morning mist, hung nearby, perfectly pressed. Evelyn reached for it with trembling fingers, the fabric cool and smooth beneath her touch. When she slipped into the dress, she hardly recognized herself in the small mirror above her dresser. The woman staring back was still her, older, lined with loss and laughter, but there was something new in her eyes. A quiet certainty, a kind of peace. The knock came softly, followed by May's familiar voice. "Are you ready, child?" Evelyn turned, smiling. "As I'll ever be." May stepped in, her face glowing with pride and nostalgia. "You look beautiful," she said simply. "James would have said you looked like spring come early." Evelyn's throat tightened. "You think Samuel would approve?" May smiled gently. "He already does. You wouldn't be standing here if he didn't." That was enough to steady her. Together they stepped out into the morning, the cold air biting their cheeks but filled with sunlight that promised warmth later. A wagon waited at the gate, its wheels already creaking over the snow. May helped Evelyn climb aboard, and as they rode toward the Carter ranch, the wind carried the sound of distant bells through the valley. Church bells, soft and bright, calling the town to witness what would be remembered as the first wedding of the new year. The Carter Ranch had been transformed. Evergreen garlands draped the beams and white ribbons fluttered from the porch railings. Inside the main room, benches Daniel Torres had built lined both sides of a makeshift aisle. Pine cones, candles, and winter berries adorned the tables. Even the old floorboards had been scrubbed to a shine. It didn't look like a ranch at all. It looked like a chapel built from hope and hard work. When Evelyn stepped through the doorway, a hush fell over the crowd. Every familiar face in Whispering Pines had gathered there. Her students, their parents, the shopkeepers, the ranch hands, the widows, and the dreamers. Even Henry Evans, who rarely ventured out since his wife's passing, stood near the front, smiling faintly. Then she saw him. Caleb Boone stood beside Reverend Cole, his best vest buttoned neatly. His dark hair combed but already rebelling against its order. His eyes found her instantly, and in that look every doubt she'd ever carried dissolved. He looked at her as if he were seeing sunlight after years of darkness, like a man who'd been wandering and had finally come home. Evelyn's steps were slow, deliberate, her hand resting lightly on May's arm as they walked down the aisle together. The murmur of the crowd faded until she could hear only her heartbeat, and the sound of Caleb's breath catching when she drew near. When she reached him, May gave her hand a squeeze before stepping aside. Caleb's voice was barely above a whisper. "You look like a miracle. And you," she said softly, "look like the reason for one." Reverend Cole cleared his throat with a kind smile, waiting until the crowd quieted again. His words, though simple, carried the weight of truth born from years of loss and faith. "Marriage," he began, "isn't for those who expect perfection. It's for those who've seen life's storms and still choose to stand together in the rain. It's for those who've lost and dared to love again. It's for those who know that grace isn't given once, it's chosen every single day." Evelyn felt Caleb's hand tighten in hers, rough and strong, grounding her as the Reverend continued. "You both know sorrow," he said, looking between them. "But you've also learned that sorrow doesn't have the final word. Today you write a new chapter, not to erase the past, but to build upon it." When it came time for their vows, Evelyn spoke first, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "Caleb, I once thought my story ended with goodbye. I believed that loss had taken everything worth loving from me. But then you showed me that love doesn't end. It just changes shape. You taught me that redemption isn't about forgetting. It's about beginning again. So I promise you this, to walk beside you through winter and harvest, through silence and laughter until the day the pines no longer whisper." The room was utterly silent. Caleb swallowed hard before he spoke, his voice rough but sure. "Evelyn, I never thought I'd stand in a place like this again, among good people with something worth fighting for. You saw me when I couldn't see myself. You forgave a man who didn't know how to ask for forgiveness. You gave me back my name, my purpose, and my hope. I promise to spend the rest of my life earning the faith you've placed in me." When Reverend Cole said, "By the grace of God, I now pronounce you husband and wife," it wasn't just a ceremony. It was a resurrection. Caleb took her face in his hands and kissed her. It was soft, reverent, full of everything they'd endured and everything they hoped for. The crowd erupted, cheers, laughter, applause. Clara wept openly. Lila clapped her hands in delight, and Daniel, awkward and proud, beamed from ear to ear. Even stoic Henry Evans wiped at his eyes. May, standing at the edge of it all, smiled like a woman who had seen enough life to know how rare this kind of joy truly was. Afterward, the room filled with music. Hank Miller tuned his fiddle, and someone began to play a slow, lilting waltz. The townsfolk formed a circle, clapping as Caleb led Evelyn onto the floor. They weren't graceful, not by any measure, but their laughter was infectious. The whole ranch echoed with the sound of celebration. Hours passed in a blur of dancing, food, and stories told by lamplight. Whispering Pines felt alive, as if the entire valley had drawn a collective breath of relief. For a night, the world's hardships seemed to lift. replaced by the easy weight of belonging. But as the evening began to quiet and the last of the guests prepared to leave, Hank Miller approached Caleb, his hat in hand. His expression was unusual, hesitant, serious. "Caleb," he said, lowering his voice, "this came for you. Ryder brought it from the South Road not an hour ago." He held out an envelope, rough-edged and stained with dust. The seal bore a single word stamped in red, Texas. Caleb frowned, taking it slowly. The handwriting was unfamiliar, firm, deliberate. "Who sent it?" Hank shook his head. "Didn't say. But the rider told me to tell you it was urgent." Evelyn, standing beside her new husband, felt her stomach tighten as Caleb turned the letter over in his hand. The music faded, the laughter dimmed, and the firelight flickered against his face as he broke the seal. Whatever lay written inside came from the very past he thought he'd buried. And the look in his eyes as he began to read told Evelyn their next test had already found them. Some inherit money, others inherit redemption. The days after the wedding unfolded like a long exhale, quiet, golden, and full of the kind of peace neither Caleb nor Evelyn had ever dared to imagine. Whispering Pines was still abuzz with talk of the New Year's ceremony, and everywhere they went people stopped to shake their hands or offer blessings. But beyond the congratulations, life began to settle again, returning to its steady rhythm. The school bell in the mornings, the hammering of ranch hands by afternoon, the hush of wind through the pines at night. It was 3 days after the wedding when Caleb came to find Evelyn in the schoolhouse. The winter sunlight poured through the tall windows, illuminating a flurry of chalk dust as she wrote on the board. Her students were gone for the day, the benches empty, the warmth of their laughter lingering faintly in the air. She turned at the sound of his boots on the wood floor and smiled, her heart still skipping a little every time she saw him. "You're early," she teased. "Did May finally let you escape her kitchen?" "Something like that," he said, though his voice carried that edge of excitement she'd learned to recognize. "Can you spare a minute? I've got something I want to show you." He held out an envelope, sturdy, thick paper sealed with wax. Evelyn frowned, wiping her hands on her skirt before taking it. "What's this?" "Just open it," he urged, that boyish grin tugging at his lips. She broke the seal and unfolded the papers inside. Her eyes darted across the words, at first uncomprehending, then she froze. Her heart stumbled. "Caleb," she whispered, "this is a land deed." He nodded slowly. 100 acres, south of the ridge, right along the creek. It's good land, Evelyn. Soil rich enough for crops and flat enough for horses. But whose? Her voice trailed off as she saw the signatures at the bottom, May Carter. He smiled wider, eyes bright with emotion. She said it was time to pass something forward. Said she didn't have children, so she'd rather see that land go to people who'll build something that lasts. People who know what second chances mean. Evelyn pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "Caleb, this is too much. We can't." "We already did," he interrupted gently. "It's ours now. Every fence post, every pine. Ours to make right." The words settled into the room like sunlight. For a moment, Evelyn couldn't speak. She looked down at the paper again, at their names written side by side, Caleb and Evelyn Boone. The ink still looked fresh, like the promise it carried. He reached for her hand. "I thought we could build there. A small house to start, then a barn. Maybe a stable once we've got the lumber. I want to raise horses again, good ones. Not the kind a man steals, but the kind a man earns." Evelyn blinked back tears. "And I could move the schoolhouse closer to the ridge," she murmured. "A place where the children could learn with sunlight and open fields instead of damp walls." Caleb's smile deepened. "And maybe someday children of our own could sit in those desks." The words made her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with something softer, richer. For the first time since Samuel's death, she allowed herself to picture a future without guilt. A porch that looked out over rolling hills. A life filled with small, ordinary joys. The following weeks passed in a blur of planning and building. The townsfolk, still giddy from the wedding, offered help wherever they could. Daniel brought his tools, proud to lend his steady hands to anything involving wood. Lila painted signs that would someday mark their gates, while May oversaw the entire effort like a seasoned foreman, barking orders with affection disguised as sternness. Evelyn, for her part, found joy in small tasks, carrying boards, fetching nails, cooking meals for the men who worked until dusk. Her laughter returned full and unguarded, startling her at times when she heard it echo across the snow. Each day the foundation grew stronger, and each night as the stars burned high above the valley, she and Caleb would walk the edges of their land, imagining what would rise there in the spring. "This place," he said one evening, his arm around her shoulders, "it's proof that we don't have to be who we were. We get to build something new." She looked up at him, the cold air pinking her cheeks. "We already are." By the middle of February, the snow had begun to recede, and with it came letters from the outside world. One afternoon, as Evelyn finished her lessons, Clara Evans lingered by her desk, clutching an envelope of her own. Her hands shook slightly. "Miss Hart," she said, her voice breathless. "It came." Evelyn frowned. "What came, Clara?" "The letter from Denver, from the nursing school." Evelyn's eyes widened as Clara thrust it into her hands. Together they read the elegant script inside. "We are pleased to inform you." Evelyn didn't make it past the first sentence before she was laughing through tears, pulling Clara into a fierce embrace. "You did it," she whispered. "You're going to be a nurse." Clara's smile wavered between disbelief and joy. "You told me I could. I just had to try." Evelyn squeezed her hand. "And you proved me right." When Clara left, Evelyn sat alone for a long while, staring at the empty desks bathed in late afternoon light. Her heart swelled with something fierce and tender, a sense that life was moving forward not just for her but for all of them. Whispering Pines was a town of survivors learning how to thrive. That evening she joined Caleb and the others on the ridge. The frame of their house now stood tall against the horizon, its beams rough-hewn and proud. Evelyn rolled up her sleeves to help hoist one of the crossbeams into place, the laughter of her neighbors carrying through the crisp air. Caleb steadied the other end, his grin wide and boyish. "Easy now," he called. "Don't let me show you up in front of half the town." Evelyn laughed. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Boone." "I've no doubt about that." The beam locked into place with a satisfying thud, and the crowd cheered. Evelyn leaned back, brushing her gloved hands together, pride rising like sunlight in her chest. But as she reached for another board, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted slightly, the noise of laughter dimming to a distant hum. Caleb was at her side in an instant. "Evelyn, you all right?" She blinked, forcing a smile. "Just stood up too fast," she murmured. "I'm fine." But even as she said it, her hand drifted unconsciously to her abdomen, where a strange flutter stirred. Soft, delicate, and alive. That night, as she lay beside Caleb beneath the half-built roof of their new home, Evelyn felt that same flutter again, a quiet, secret rhythm beneath her ribs. She smiled in the dark, her fingers pressed to her stomach. Unbeknownst to her husband, their greatest creation had already begun. Beneath the melting snow, life begins again, unseen but unstoppable. Winter loosened its hold on Whispering Pines slowly, as if reluctant to let go. The icicles began to drip, the snowbanks sank, and the valley's streams broke free of their icy shells, singing once more beneath the sun. For Evelyn Boone, the thaw came not only to the land but to her very heart. Every morning now brought light through the east window of the half-finished ranch house, and with it came the promise of something new, something she could scarcely believe. She'd first suspected it one chilly dawn when the scent of coffee, once her comfort, turned her stomach. Caleb had laughed softly, brushing the hair from her face as she hurried outside to catch her breath. "You all right, sweetheart?" he'd asked, the usual concern in his voice. She'd nodded, embarrassed, insisting it was nothing but the cold. Yet as the days passed, the signs grew clearer. The faintest roundness at her waist, the steady warmth that seemed to live under her ribs, the exhaustion that came not from labor but from creation. It was May Carter who confirmed it, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You've got that glow about you," May said one afternoon, crossing her arms as Evelyn grated papers by the fire. "And don't you dare tell me it's the lamplight." Evelyn had blushed, laughing nervously. "May I—" "Hush," the older woman interrupted with a knowing smile. "A woman who's known as much loss as you has earned the right to a miracle or two. You best tell that husband of yours before he starts thinking you're hiding something serious." That evening, as twilight painted the sky in lavender and gold, Evelyn waited on the porch of their nearly finished home. The scent of sawdust and pine hung thick in the cool air. Caleb approached from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, the last rays of sunlight glinting in his hair. When she told him, her voice trembling, the words felt like both confession and prayer. "Caleb," she whispered, "we're going to have a child." He froze, the rag slipping from his hand. For a moment the world seemed to still. No sound but the creek running nearby. No movement but the breath that left his chest in a shaky laugh. He stepped forward, eyes wide, as though afraid she might vanish if he reached too quickly. "Evelyn," he said hoarsely, "are you sure?" She nodded, smiling through tears. "May says I'm about 3 months along." He didn't answer at first, just pulled her into his arms, holding her, as though she were made of glass and gold all at once. When he finally spoke, his voice broke with joy. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "You, this land, now a child, after everything I've done." Evelyn pressed her hand to his chest. "You've earned every bit of it, Caleb Boone. We both have." After that night, the world seemed to bloom in ways they hadn't noticed before. As winter's grip loosened, life surged back into the valley. The snowmelt fed the creek that wound through their land, and wildflowers began pushing through the thawing earth. Caleb finished the roof by mid-March, his hammer echoing through the hills, and by April their home stood complete. 2 bedrooms, a sturdy porch, and windows that caught both sunrise and sunset. Evelyn loved every board and beam of it. She helped where she could, smoothing paint across walls, sewing curtains from spare fabric, arranging her small collection of books on a handmade shelf. The house felt alive, infused with laughter and the faint rhythm of new beginnings. Each night when she and Caleb sat before the fire, she'd rest his hand on her stomach where life stirred faintly beneath her skin. He'd close his eyes, reverent, as if listening for the heartbeat of forgiveness itself. Whispering Pines, too, was waking. New families arrived that spring, drawn by the promise of fertile land and community. Evelyn's schoolhouse was busier than ever. The children came early, eager to learn, and stayed late, helping her with small chores. Clara wrote often from Denver, her letters full of excitement about nursing school and stories of the city. Daniel's benches still stood sturdy in the church, his craftsmanship praised by everyone who saw them. Lila's poems had been printed in a Santa Fe newspaper, and she'd begun teaching the younger children to write their own verses. Evelyn often found herself watching her students, laughing, growing, dreaming, and thinking how their progress mirrored her own. Once she'd been afraid to live fully again, afraid to hope. Now she carried life inside her, both literal and symbolic. It wasn't just her child that was coming into being. It was the future she'd once thought she'd lost. Caleb became almost comically protective. Every time she lifted something heavier than a kettle, he was there in seconds, his hands ready to take it from her. "I'm pregnant, not helpless," she'd scold, though her laughter always softened the words. "I know," he'd reply, grinning, "but you're carrying the most important thing I've ever had a hand in making. Humor me." The days lengthened, the snow vanished, and the pines whispered with the soft winds of early spring. Some evenings they'd walk the ridge where their land met the forest, the air filled with the scent of sap and new grass. Caleb would talk about fencing in the east pasture or building a stable big enough for 10 horses, while Evelyn dreamed aloud about adding more desks to the schoolhouse and planting wildflowers around its windows. "You know," she said one evening, leaning into him as the sky blazed orange. "We're not just building a ranch. We're building a legacy." He looked at her, eyes warm. "Then let's make it one worth remembering." For a while, it seemed nothing could touch them. Each sunrise felt like a promise kept, each evening like a reward for endurance. Evelyn's pregnancy progressed smoothly. Her cheeks glowed with health, her laughter easy and frequent. The town adored her, fussing over her as if she were their collective treasure. May visited almost daily, bringing broth or sweet rolls for strength. Even the school children were gentler, carrying her books or sweeping the classroom without being asked. It was a life stitched together with joy and purpose, fragile but shining, and perhaps that was why the shadow came so suddenly. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day when the air smelled of rain but the sky still held blue. Evelyn had just dismissed her class and was closing up the schoolhouse when she heard the sound of hooves. A single rider approached fast along the main road, his horse lathered with sweat. He reined in hard before the steps, his hat pulled low, his face lined from travel. "Mrs. Boone?" he called. "Caleb Boone's wife?" Evelyn straightened, unease prickling the back of her neck. "Yes." "What's this about?" The man dismounted, pulling a folded envelope from his coat. The paper was stained with dust, the seal pressed in red wax. "Letter from Texas, ma'am. Said to deliver it straight to your husband's hands, urgent." Evelyn stared at the letter as if it might burn her. The word Texas felt heavy, a place Caleb rarely spoke of except in shadows and half-truths. "Thank you," she managed, taking it carefully. The rider tipped his hat and rode off before she could ask more. As she stood alone in the empty schoolyard, the letter's edges fluttering in the spring wind, Evelyn felt her peace tremble. Whatever was written inside came from the past Caleb had buried, and it was now galloping back toward them fast as any storm on the plains. The past always rides back, and it never knocks first. The letter lay unopened on the kitchen table for 2 full days. Evelyn had handed it to Caleb that evening after supper, her hand trembling slightly as she said, "A rider brought this from Texas." He had stared at it for a long while before sliding it aside, his jaw tight. "Tomorrow," he'd murmured. "I'll open it tomorrow." But tomorrow came and went, and the envelope remained sealed, its silence heavier than any words it might contain. Evelyn didn't press him. She had learned that some wounds reopened on their own when touched too quickly. Still, she could feel the tension coiling inside him, the way his shoulders stiffened when the wind shifted, the way his gaze flicked toward the road every time a rider passed. Finally, on the 3rd night, when the fire had burned low and the world outside their windows was hushed beneath a quilt of starlight, Caleb reached for the envelope. His hands were steady as he broke the wax. But his eyes carried the same storm that had once lived there when he first came to Whispering Pines. Evelyn sat across from him, her fingers laced together on the table. He read in silence, the only sound the faint crackle of firewood. Then he folded the letter and set it down slowly. "It's from Marshall Everett," he said, his voice low. "Out of Austin." Evelyn's heart tightened. What does he want? Caleb exhaled through his nose. "Says a man named Luther Briggs has been talking. Claims he rode with me the night I stole those horses, says I never served my full sentence. He's telling folks the bounty on my head was never cleared. There's talk of sending a marshal out to confirm it." For a moment, the room felt colder. The fire flickered, throwing their shadows long across the floor. Evelyn shook her head. "But you paid your debt. You served your time." "I did," Caleb said. "But Texas doesn't always care about the truth. The law's a thing men twist when it suits them." He rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of his past pressing down like the years he'd spent carrying it. If a marshal comes, he might not listen. Men like him see a record, not a man. Evelyn stood, the edge in her voice surprising even herself. "Then he'll hear it from me." Caleb looked up sharply. "Evelyn." "No," she interrupted. "You're not that man anymore, Caleb Boone. The town knows it. I know it. You built desks for children who had nothing. You helped May through her winters. You've rebuilt half this valley with your own hands. If a marshal wants to drag you back into the past, he'll have to go through all of us first." Her voice trembled with fury and love. For a moment, Caleb could only stare at her, his throat working as though he wanted to speak but couldn't. Finally, he reached for her hand, pressing his calloused palm over her softer one. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles," he said softly. She met his eyes. "It's not your battle alone anymore." The next morning, whispers had already begun to drift through Whispering Pines. Word traveled faster than wind in a town so small. Some had heard about the letter, others guessed, but the story grew with each telling. By midday, the whole valley seemed to know. A marshal might be coming for Caleb Boone. Evelyn braced herself for judgment, but it never came. Instead, what came was something unexpected: solidarity. Old Hank Miller nailed a sign outside the general store that read, "We stand with Boone." Clara wrote from Denver offering to come home if needed. Daniel and Lila spread word to every homestead that no lawman would touch one of their own without answering to the town first. Even Reverend Cole spoke during Sunday service, his voice echoing against the church rafters. "There is no man beyond redemption. We measure character not by mistakes, but by what's built afterward." Caleb listened quietly from the back pew, his head bowed, his hand wrapped tightly around Evelyn's. As the days passed, the tension grew, but so did their resolve. May Carter kept her rifle loaded and within reach, muttering, "If that marshal's fool enough to come riding in here, he better bring more than a badge." The town laughed, but beneath it was a fierce protectiveness. Whispering Pines had been built by outcasts, widows, and wanderers. They all had something in their pasts worth forgiving. One late afternoon, a distant dust trail appeared on the horizon, a single rider moving steady toward the town. The moment Caleb saw him, he knew. The weight of memory pressed down, but this time he didn't flinch. "I need to meet him alone," he said quietly. Evelyn started to protest, but the calm in his eyes stopped her. "If I'm ever going to bury my past," he said, "I have to look it in the eye." She nodded, though her heart felt like it was being wrung dry. "Then I'll be waiting when you come home." The marshal rode in just before dusk, a tall man with a weathered face and the look of someone who'd seen more than he cared to remember. The town watched from windows and porches as he dismounted in front of the saloon where Caleb waited. The two men spoke quietly for a long while, too low for anyone to hear. When at last they emerged, the tension in Caleb's shoulders had melted away. The marshal tipped his hat to the gathered crowd. "I came here to see a criminal," he said, "but all I found was a man who's already paid every debt worth paying." May Carter let out a loud "Ha!" that broke the silence. Someone started clapping. Then everyone joined in. It wasn't just applause, it was a collective exhale, a release of months, years of fear and doubt. Evelyn stepped forward, tears already blurring her vision. The marshal nodded once more to Caleb before riding off into the dying light. Caleb turned then, his gaze finding Evelyn's across the crowd. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. The noise, the cold, the onlookers, and all that remained was her. When she reached him, he pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "It's done," he whispered. "It's finally done." She pressed a hand to his cheek. "No, Caleb, it's begun." That night, as snow began to fall again, soft and early, the first of the coming winter, Evelyn sat by the window watching the flakes swirl through the dark. The fire crackled, the house warm, the land outside blanketed in quiet peace. Caleb was fixing something at the hearth, humming under his breath, the sound of a man no longer haunted. Evelyn felt a sudden movement within her, a gentle kick, startling and sure. Her hand flew to her stomach, eyes widening in wonder. "Caleb," she whispered, smiling through tears, "come here. The baby, he's moving." Caleb knelt beside her, his rough hand joining hers, feeling that small, miraculous flutter beneath her ribs. His eyes shone as he looked at her. Outside, the snow thickened, coating the pines in silver. The world had come full circle from winter to winter, but this time there was no sorrow in the silence. only life, steady and unstoppable. As the snow continued to fall, Evelyn whispered a prayer of thanks, her fingers still resting where life stirred within her. Somewhere in the quiet between heartbeat and snowfall, she realized the truth of it all, that no past, no matter how dark, could stand against the relentless light of what was coming next. When the wind sings through the pines, it tells a story of those brave enough to love again. The year had turned full circle. The mountains stood the same as they had before, unchanging, silent sentinels, but everything beneath them had transformed. Whispering Pines was no longer a quiet, struggling settlement on the edge of nowhere. It had become a place of laughter, of purpose, of second chances. And as the first cool breath of autumn swept through the valley, carrying with it the scent of pine and wood smoke, Evelyn Boone stood on the schoolhouse steps and thought about how much could change in a single year. 1 year ago, she had been a widow stepping off a train, her heart cracked open, her life nothing but questions. Now she was a wife, a teacher, a soon-to-be mother, and part of a town that had taught her what belonging really meant. Her students had gone for the day, their laughter echoing faintly down the dirt road that wound through the valley. She watched them disappear one by one, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach, where life moved gently beneath her skin. The schoolhouse smelled faintly of chalk and cedar oil, the scent of a day well lived. Behind her, the door creaked open. Caleb stepped inside, his frame filling the doorway. He was dressed in work clothes dusted with hay, his hat tipped low, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You look like you're thinking mighty hard," he said, voice warm and teasing. Evelyn turned, smiling. "Just remembering. This time last year, I thought I'd lost everything." He crossed the room to her, taking her hand and pressing it to his chest. "And now?" "Now," she said softly. "I know I had to lose everything to find what mattered." They left the schoolhouse together, locking up for the weekend, and began the slow walk home. The afternoon light was golden, pouring through the branches in long, soft beams that turned the dust in the air into drifting sparks. The wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like whispering voices, and Evelyn listened to it, half believing the land itself remembered all the stories that had unfolded here. The grief, the grace, the redemption. Along the way, they passed the Carter Ranch. May was sitting on her porch, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her eyes sharp and kind as ever. She waved them over. "You two look like a painting," she said, smiling. "A tired painting, but a good one." Evelyn laughed. "We're well, May. The baby's been restless all morning." May leaned forward, eyes twinkling. "That's a good sign. Means he'll be strong, just like his mama." Caleb chuckled. "If he's anything like her, I'm in for a handful." May's laughter joined theirs, a sound as familiar as the rustle of leaves. "You've both done right by this place," she said after a pause. "By yourselves. Whispering Pines is better because you stayed. You built something that'll last longer than either of you." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "We couldn't have done it without you." "Maybe," May said, standing. "But you did the hard part, believing again." She touched Evelyn's arm, then looked toward the setting sun. "Now go on home. That wind's getting colder." They continued down the path, hand in hand. The world around them glowed with the colors of autumn, golden grasses, copper leaves, the distant peaks dusted with the first hints of snow. The land felt alive, humming with the quiet music of change. As they walked, Evelyn thought about those who had moved beyond this valley yet remained part of its story. Clara's letters arrived every few weeks from Denver, full of tales from nursing school. Patients she cared for, lessons learned, moments of doubt followed by triumph. "You taught me that helping others makes life worth living," Clara had written in her most recent note. "I carry your voice with me every day." Lila the poet had her work published again, this time in a national paper. Her verses about Whispering Pines, its hardships and heart, had been praised for their raw, honest beauty. She sent Evelyn a copy with a simple inscription, "For the teacher who taught me to find poetry in pain." And Daniel, the quiet boy with steady hands, had applied to an engineering school in New Mexico. His designs for bridges and grain mills had caught the attention of a professor in Santa Fe who saw in him something rare, vision born from struggle. Evelyn thought of them often, her first class, her first proof that one life could ripple outward, changing others in ways unseen. The thought filled her with warmth as she and Caleb reached the ridge where their home stood, the house he'd built with his own 2 hands. The porch light flickered to life as dusk deepened. Evelyn paused, taking in the sight, the steady smoke from the chimney, the corral stretching beyond, the faint glow of lamplight through the window. It was all so simple, yet it felt sacred. Inside, the fire was already burning. Caleb poured her a cup of tea, then knelt to unlace his boots. "You tired?" he asked. "Always," she said with a soft laugh, sinking into the rocker by the fire. "But it's a good kind of tired." He joined her, sitting close enough that their knees brushed. For a long moment they said nothing. The flames shifted, painting gold across his face. Evelyn broke the silence first. "Do you ever wonder why it happened the way it did? The train, the station, me being left behind?" Caleb nodded slowly. "Every day. But I figure if you hadn't missed that train, I'd still be a man trying to outrun his past. You'd still be trying to hold on to yours." She smiled, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "Maybe that's what grace really is. 2 broken people meeting in the middle of their ruins." He reached for her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles over her skin. "You saved me, Evelyn, not just from what I'd done, but from what I might have become." She leaned in, resting her forehead against his. "We saved each other." Outside, the wind began to rise, threading through the pines, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and early frost. The sound was almost like words, low, melodic, ancient. Evelyn closed her eyes, listening. That night before they went to bed, she stood at the window, watching the stars spill across the dark sky. The moon hung low, silvering the land they'd built together. She thought of Samuel, not with sorrow anymore, but with gratitude. He had been her first love, her foundation. Caleb was her second, her home. Both had shaped her, both had made her brave. She turned to Caleb, who stood behind her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. He frowned slightly. "For what?" "For waiting," she whispered. "For believing. For finding me when I didn't even know I was lost." He smiled, kissing her forehead. "Thank you for being worth the wait." They lay together as the night deepened, the fire crackling low, the wind whispering just beyond the walls. Evelyn's hand rested over the curve of her belly, feeling the steady heartbeat of the life within her, a rhythm that matched the soft pulse of the world outside. In the stillness, she spoke a truth that had taken her a lifetime to learn, her voice barely more than a breath. Sometimes the best beginnings come from the worst endings. Outside, the wind caught her words and carried them through the valley, winding between cabins and trees, across fields and streams. It moved through the hearts of those who lived there, through May by her window, through the children who would someday tell this story to their own, and became part of the song that lived forever in the whispering pines. Long after the fire burned low, the wind continued its gentle hymn, weaving Evelyn's words into legend. And in that quiet corner of the Arizona frontier where broken souls once sought shelter, the story of Caleb and Evelyn Boone became more than memory. It became a promise carried on the wind, that love once found never truly fades. If this story of love, loss, and redemption touched your heart, don't forget to stay with us for the next tale from the Western frontier. Every week we bring you new stories of courage, second chances, and the kind of love that survives the hardest storms. Like this video if you believe in hope after heartbreak, and subscribe so you don't miss what rides in next. Your comments keep these stories alive. Tell us what part stayed with you the most down below.